So on to our next session, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our next speaker, who is Tom Lowe. Tom is a senior lecturer in higher education at Portsmouth University, and his research interests include student engagement and the development of education, embedding employability and belonging. So and so much more. I've been a huge fan of Tom's work for about the last 5 years, since we had a really random chance meeting on campus at Liverpool and found a lot of shared interest, and we've sort of continued the conversation since then. So I'm really keen to listen to Tom today, and yeah, huge welcome, and over to you.
Hi there, everybody. Really good to be here, and thank you, Emma, for that warm introduction. I'm just going to share my screen, and then we'll get going with the presentation. So just to check with everyone, you can see my slides on full screen now. Is that okay? And can you see that okay, Emma?
Yes, that's great, Tom.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to Handshake and to Grad Consult for inviting me to this session today. Again, I've had lots of interesting conversations, and it's good to hear the Q&A that was just going on right now around student engagement in contemporary higher education, the higher education of today. And it was wonderful to get asked with such an open title for this session, which was to talk about the different themes of student engagement and themes for development that we're looking at in our institutions. Much of my reflections come from my own role. So I have spent time working in lots of different roles in universities, and I have the great luxury at the moment to be in a research-focused role looking at higher education, where at the University of Portsmouth, I lead on those development themes for staff, and mainly for academic staff and courses related to student engagement and embedding employability into the curriculum. Many of you here today are from careers professional backgrounds or in those roles at the moment. I previously led a careers service at the University of Winchester throughout the pandemic, but I'm also the chair of the RAISE network, and the RAISE network I can give more information about afterwards. Is a free to join network for anybody that works or studies in higher education, no matter your role title, professional service, academic, whether you've been working in higher education for 2 weeks or 30 years, everybody's welcome to talk about student engagement. So in this presentation for the next 20 minutes, I'll talk about some of my different thoughts of the challenges, particularly for careers services and employability services, but also wider what's going on in higher education and the higher education we're experiencing today. I've seen part of the delegate list, and I know the majority of you are from UK higher education. And I'm going to jump straight to the title of student success. We are increasingly in a student success or student outcomes focused higher education. And for those of you who are in England, this has particularly been brought into prominence due to the Office for Students, who have in their first publication in 2018, said they wish that all students from all backgrounds with the ability and desire to undertake higher education are not only supported to access, that's get into higher education, but succeed during and progress from into graduate employment. Now, that's we've particularly seen with the B3 metric, where this mission statement has been put into practice, seeing universities being given percentage targets to meet with threatened fines if students don't make it through their higher education journey compared to the national sector, not based on mission group, but based on national benchmarks. And that's created all this pressure and noise about student success. In the Higher Education Act in 2017, student success is simply defined as completing your degree. That's quite mechanical to me. I think that's quite boring. I think when you speak to students, actually they'll say that success means so many more things to them. For some students, it will be just getting to university, just passing university, yes. But for other students, it will be achieving that graduate role. It will be getting a first on their assignment, or it may just be doing a profession that they're proud of in the future. Student success has been written about en masse actually in the United States higher education. Why is that? Well, they massified first, marketized first, and there's actually no literature conclusion really in Weatherton. There's just literature review on student success. But the majority of the language when we talk about student success is relating to grades, student outcomes, and retention. But when we talk about student success, we always come back to student engagement. And that's because we know that those students that are engaged in their university engaged in their course, engaged in our services, are more likely to succeed, no matter what definition of succeed you use. Professor George Koo highlights that student engagement represents the time and energy students invest in educational activities, but also the efforts that we invest in our students. It's not just students engaging with us, it's us as a university engaging with them. And of course, we know that if students are more engaged, they are more likely to succeed. So we often return to conversations about student engagement. We become worried about student engagement if it's not seeming to happen in a way we think student engagement should be happening. And we become worried when the student engagement game changes. And I've just overheard that last question there talking about things like GPT. The university is ever changing, education is ever changing, and technology and society is ever changing. And therefore, the way that students engage and how we see their engagement is going to continue to change. And if anything, we've got to be up for the ride, and we've got to be ready to adapt if we want the modern university to succeed. Just to start off, I want to talk about how we define student engagement. And I think student engagement can be defined in many ways, and endless ways, actually. And there's even literature by Colin Bryce and Liz Dunn that says that. But quite traditional definitions of student engagement will be those things you see in the classroom, like paying attention, listening, or maybe engaging with your service, attending or not attending, taking notes, asking questions, participating in volunteering or a placement. These are quite traditional definitions of student engagement. We can see that students are engaging or not, and perhaps these are things that we can measure. Some of them are more interpretable. How do you really know if somebody's listening? Some people actively nod and yes, they're listening. Other people maybe look completely blank, but they are listening thoroughly within their minds. So what engagement we can measure is becoming harder and harder to tell. We use the term student engagement for everything in higher education, and perhaps we overuse the term student engagement because our sector has made it into a buzzword, put it on our strategies. We even put it in people's job titles. My prior job was a head of student engagement and employability, and I know loads of people with those kind of titles. It can mean lots of other things like student surveys, increasingly accessing the VLE, the digital footprint of students, getting involved in student activities, conversation about student success, I've said, this great dominance of student voice, largely thanks to the Quality Assurance Agency, conversations about belonging and community. We are in a renewed phase of talking about belonging again, particularly led by the work of Wonky, employability, student staff liaison committees, work with university retention, loads of things. I think as professionals and academics who are working in front of students on a day-to-day basis and just want to help, these conversations about student engagement can become quite frustrating because we can often get into a place where we're asking, well, what do you mean by student engagement? And in 2010, which was 12 years ago, there was a literature review conducted by Vicky Trowler looking at the definitions of student engagement, looking at the published literature on student engagement and higher education. The three categories that Vicky Trowler came up with fit into these three. Now, I show these on the board now because they actually do have a lot of relevance today still, and it's important for us to make the split of what kind of student engagement we are talking about. So the first being emotional engagement, feelings, satisfaction, belonging, alienation, cognitive engagement, things we learn, and then behavioralist things that we can maybe see students do, and they're the measurable engagements. And we become a bit obsessed with the measurable engagements. So did students click on it or not? Did students watch it or not? Did students attend or not? Since the great focus particularly led by the QAA and the NUS, there's been another brand and area of activities that I've written about in an upcoming book chapter on where a lot of student engagement also is now looking at this idea of engaging students in developing the university, engaging students in their voice, in developing our services and our courses, doing things like co-design. My recommendation for this is simple. Be clear from the start. We can all get quite bogged down with definitions of student engagement, and I've spent far too many committees, conferences, and different discussions saying, what do we mean by student engagement? If you're ever having conversations about student engagement, simply say we are defining student engagement in regards to engaging with the careers service. We are defining student engagement in regards to accessing our jobs board. We are defining student engagement in regards to students having a say in how we run our service. You won't go far wrong. You have to repeat that definition throughout your projects. But if you start your committee saying, let's talk about student engagement and employability, you can end up getting very bogged down. So the buzzword can become the fuzzword. And even though the term is flexible, the lack of conceptual clarity does carry risks. So we've got to be clear from the start. So let's go to our context, English higher education. Well, and that's where the majority of you are from today. Students are still coming in gigantic numbers, 50% of 18-year-olds. And they're still coming knowing that there's going to be a £9,000 tuition fee, that there's been tuition fees for 22 years in English higher education. And there's a lot of rhetoric, particularly from the press, taxpayers, parents, maybe students themselves, and the government asking for that value for money in higher education. This creates a lot of pressure. It's quite a crucible of pressure within higher education to ensure we have excellent services, world-leading teaching, and fulfilling that promise of higher education, which is you'll have the time of your life and you'll get a graduate outcome following. Whether that is a £1 million a year job, or if that's to be a role that you're proud of. And I think we've got to respect that different students will want different things. We can't ignore the catalyst of change that COVID placed upon HE, and this is my first area for development, is probably don't forget that COVID happened. We saw a huge portion of our students go through, and no matter what age they were, whether they were 5 years old or they were 25 years old, they went through 18 months of social distancing. A whole generation of students have experienced distance learning now. They know if they love it, but they also know if they really hate it. But we've got into behavioural norms of maybe thinking, oh, I'll just tune in online today, I don't need to go in. And perhaps we've seen behaviours change from how we engage in the educational setting. Mental health has increased, and poor mental health at that. And we came into understanding a lot more about our students' home education setting. We often talked about postcodes and demographics. We didn't talk about how much financial or technological support our students have. And I think this is ongoing. We must not quickly forget COVID. I think COVID is being quickly forgotten in our education, because all of the challenges we're facing now, like the cost of living crisis and attendance, are inspired by that education journey our students went through in the international crisis of COVID-19. And one thing I'm being asked a lot in my job is students aren't attending, Tom, what do we do? And this is a new phenomenon that's occurred. It's a very good blog from Ed Foster, which I've summarised on here, where he essentially said there's not one issue, there's not one reason why students aren't attending. It is not that because students are lazy, it is not because students don't care. There's lots of issues out there. And actually, often these factors are coming together into sometimes a decision made that morning when a student may think, I don't perceive it to be relevant for me to go in, I cannot afford to go in, I'm going to instead choose to go to work. I'm speaking with students relating to the cost of living crisis right now, and although a lot of student unions at the start of this academic year were saying we need food banks on campus, actually what we're seeing is a lot of students are just working part-time a lot. And because of Brexit, there are far more vacancies in the service sector, and they're working far too much to get through their time. I'm going to talk more about technology as well going forward, but there's lots to consider in this space of why students aren't attending. And what I think actually there's an urgent need for research. I don't have the answers yet. This is a fresh problem, but we need to be talking about it. The answer often is to talk with our students, and I've written, my first book is on this topic a lot around how we engage with our students, and I do think that is the first step we should take. We're facing challenges in regards to student engagement and the university, which is going to change really quickly. This whole AI assignment thing is interesting. There was something by Advanced HE talking about the university in 2036, where actually avatars will do all the teaching. We can't just be worried about students faking their essays or faking their job applications. We need to be worried about, actually, are some of these robots going to take over the way our jobs are worked, or the way our services worked? Are we okay with embracing this technology and saying, well, actually, that's going to make the university something that only exists on someone's laptop? Or do we want to protect some of those rich engagements that we know makes the university experience? So, of course, engaging students' voice is beneficial to increase satisfaction and belonging, but that greater understanding of students and staff. I used to get frustrated with staff saying, well, when I was a student, it was like this, so we should do it that way. You can't do that anymore after the pandemic. I think that phrase is very redundant after you've been out of universities 2 years. Interesting, that's why a lot of student unions only allow their sabbatical officers to run for 2 years, because they go out of date. We can't relate to our education experience anymore. We have to be working with students on that. We talk a lot about engaging in the student voice, and this is really easy to do for academics. You've got the same students in front of you every week. And we can say we want our students to be partners, not customers, but it's a lot more difficult for professional services to do this. What do we need to consider if we want to engage the student voice for, like, say, an employability service? Well, actually, some of our services are very transactional. That's what we do. A student comes in, they ask for some resources, and they leave. How do we build a relationship where we can ask them for feedback? We have to balance our capacity as well. So if we do lots of outreach, are we going to be dealing with the income of capacity following? We don't have as much weekly student staff contact, and we're increasingly digital. We're increasingly putting things online like chatbots and things. So we're not seeing students as much. And even some professional services have a purchasing element to them. So students are customers, not so much career services, certainly like estate services and catering services on campus. And sometimes those students we engage, we don't know if they're representing all students' opinions. That's quite interesting. Another thing we've got to be aware of is we have to move quickly with this. So we've got to engage students, and that takes time, and that is interesting. So for example, I spoke to a colleague and they said, I've been told to rewrite my curriculum. I'm going to do it with my students in partners. And their manager said to them, how long is it going to take you? And they said, well, if I do it with students as partners, it's going to take 6 months. They said, well, I need it quicker. And I said, well, if I do it alone, I can do it in 2 weeks. We have to move quickly, though, because of the B3 measures we're placed upon. And with the National Student Survey, I have a rule of 4. The survey results come out in August. We should spend 4 days celebrating or commiserating and doing all the press releases and doing all the party side of, yay, this course did really well. Really, if we want to make change at pace, we have to decide in August, what are we going to do in those 4 weeks to ensure our student experience is good from September or change from September, and then 4 months to prove it. So many universities will have their first NSS meeting in November. It's too late. It doesn't work. With graduate outcomes, I'm still creating a rule of 4. It's far more complicated. But for example, if you had an academic colleague that was making an enhancement with a course with a load of third years this spring in 2023, you wouldn't see the league table benefit of that until September 2025. How do we make time for such delayed data? And I say this a lot when I work with academics related to student employability. I say, if you don't make this change right now, it's going to be 2028 before you know it. And we've seen what's happened at some universities with poor graduate outcomes. Courses have become under threat. There's a lot of talk around mapping. We've got to understand what we do. Universities are very complicated institutions. There's lots of different services pulling on students' time. And there's a lot of people who say we need to map the student experience. I think it's a really worthy activity to do. I would go on to say there's not a single student experience, though. There's actually several students' experiences, and students engage in different ways. But mapping students' experiences is really important. Having conversations with students is really important. We use data a lot, increasingly in universities, and there's been universities really leading the way with this, Nottingham, Trent, Coventry. And the data is very valuable. It enables us to look how our students are engaging online, but that is only part of the picture. We've also got to reflect on how much our students actually know, how much we're monitoring them, what are the unanticipated outcomes of us monitoring our students, and are they able to opt out? When students join universities, they often say agree to have all their data analysed. They're not getting to opt out in the same way we're seeing social media is allowing us to opt out. So we've got to revisit the purpose constantly. But I've been involved in doing lots of fun activities at different universities and mapping the student experience. And, you know, you do it with one department, you do it with just a career service, it might look something like this. This is an example from a student union looking at student voice. You know, it's just a few activities. We're not asking too much. You add their degree in there and you think, oh, actually, it's quite busy. And then at my prior University of Winchester, we did actually map the entire student experience. And it becomes this chaotic, gigantic experience where you're like, hang about, we are asking students to do so much. I think sometimes we should take a step back, come together as services and talk about what we're asking students to engage in. So to begin to kind of round off my final points, many of our students will only engage in their degree. And I published a blog the other day saying, actually we need to focus on the core of the student experience. And that sometimes is the curriculum, because the extracurricular, the services aren't available to all students. Some students are part-time, some students have caring responsibilities. Some students, and more students, are working every hour they're not either doing their assignments or at their course. And we are going to have to make some tough decisions of what we do with that contact time. I've been involved in work at Portsmouth and Winchester with saying, actually, we need to embed employability in the curriculum. We don't need to bury employability in the curriculum. We need to be overt. And actually what we need is to ensure that actually we are training some graduate application skills in the curriculum, as well as those transferable, durable skills they're following, things like how to write a personal statement or a personal specification. Of course, career services do this, but if you want to get that 100% engagement, it is quite difficult. Moving forward, we're going to have to make trade-offs. We're going to have to be flexible. In the pandemic, we moved online for safety reasons. Then perhaps we came back because that was our structure, for financial reasons or political reasons. There's a lot of people making choices for perhaps convenience reasons. Oh, I'll engage online because it's easier. I think we're going to have difficult discussions over saying, no, that's a face-to-face activity, because that's better for learning, it's better for skills development, it's better for community building. But we've got to know our students' demographics when we do that. We've got to ensure we remain accessible to all students. But there will be some things in course design and service design that will mean our service might not be able to be accessible to all, but to achieve the purpose of maybe boosting employability skills, we may have to do some of those activities. So we've got to be quite critical. So I don't endorse face-to-face or online. I endorse that we have a debate on these topics. And we're going to have to unlock from the old normal. Here's a picture of a campus bubble. A student said to me once, the best thing about studying at this university is the campus bubble. If you're inside it, it's amazing. And if you're outside it, it's awful. But I think we're still designing programs around students and we need to be designing programs around students and employers, and not designing programs around staff and semesters. We put everything in 9 to 5 because that's when everyone's at work, but that's not most convenient to all students. We design courses that fit with our semester structure, but that's not mostly convenient for employers. We are over-reliant on a traditional campus structure based on a historic university, which is largely based on Oxbridge, and we need to break out of those. And the innovation in degree apprenticeships at Portsmouth has been really good. So the police degree apprenticeship at Portsmouth has 16 entry points, really interesting. But so many universities are still so rigid, and we're not willing to take big risks because some of these are costly. And that's why we see most courses that are developed to full-time undergraduate, because they're far financially safer. We're not even going into that community college model as much because perhaps the tuition fee is less and it's more risky. But to be truly accessible to students, I think we're going to have to explore those. So to round off, really, I think looking at career services and employability, you all know this in regards to student engagement. Our duty of care is extending beyond while they're here studying to go into that graduate life. And that graduate life area is still really ripe for development at many universities, how we talk about that, how we get academics involved in that, and actually how we benefit with other alumni activities, whether that's for income generation or for other engagement agendas, how we benefit from our alumni wanting to stay actively engaged in our communities. And we can jump on that using things like mentoring. I've found that students want to see people who have gone through their struggle. They want to see alumni who are 2 or 3 years out, not 25 years out, because they'll say, well, you didn't pay for university. They want to see students who have been through a similar journey to them. And belonging is the answer to many. They say we need to create a high sense of belonging. And I did a study in 2017 asking when students found a sense of belonging. And it's actually the entire student experience that gives a sense of belonging, from enrolling to getting your acceptance letter, to attending class, to engaging in services who believe in you. Not all of us, we can't really say to students, oh, you'll get a sense of belonging at our careers service, but we can give a sense of mattering. We can ensure that all our students feel like they matter to us, and perhaps then they will come back and engage with us. So I think when we talk about engagement, we just talk about staff and students, but when we're talking about employability, career services and engagement and development areas, I think the partners are far wider. And I know this is standard for many employability services, but it's not for many academic departments. And really, my final message would be to say that really looking at things like graduate outcomes in the NSS and retention, we need every staff member to be on board with that. I think we are there with NSS. Every staff member says, I can't be mean to students, I can't be boring, the students will lead to poor NSS. But we're not there yet where people see graduate outcomes is everyone's job, or retention is everybody's job. So it's really good to talk to you today. I've rattled on quite well. My slides will be shared and references included. And my email's there for anyone who wants to get in contact. Okay.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. I think we've got time to just squeeze in a couple of questions that have come in during the session. So first question from Josh Armstrong. Whilst there is a national increase in regulation of HE and outcomes, how can we ensure that institutions do not become over-focused on the metrics and conditions and keep student engagement and student satisfaction at the heart of decision making?
You can become we saw many universities in the 2010s become completely obsessed with money, and money was the drive, and with prior agendas that were more dominant. So, and this is a critique of the English higher education sector is over-regulated, many would say, and we saw the dominance of the REF, we saw the dominance of the NSS, but we are now in a situation where not just for financial reasons that success and retention and graduate outcomes matter. I think what's really important is to take these conversations beyond the boardroom. I think so often these just take place in the boardroom only, and they are seen as data. Students can very quickly become numbers in those conversations, and they stop being people. And we need to ensure that, especially during this distance time, that managers more and more are living in meetings, online meetings particularly, they're not speaking to students as much. And we've got to, of course, get students in the room. But when I talk about student voice with professional services, I say, enable your staff to go out and just talk with students and ask them why they came to study at your university. What challenges are they facing? What are they enjoying right now? What's working really, really well? And it's remembering the person at the heart of that and remembering why you're there. The regulation is going to make, it's basically added it's tripled the amount of metrics that are going to be focused in regards to students. And that is going to be a challenge. But there's not one size that fits all. Actually, in the courses I'm working at Portsmouth related to mainly in regards to retention and employability, there's different solutions for each of those individual disciplines. And that's how local we have got to get with this. And actually enabling staffing to support those programs and doing that is really important. And for those staff members to talk about their experiences. Sometimes we can be very top down. Manager says you've got to do more for graduate outcomes. Do this. And we don't listen to them first, and they know their students and program best. So I think value the individual, have conversations, we have to work with time and pace, yes, but we've got to have conversations and speak to each other about this. We just can't be metric-driven robots.
I agree. It's that local and personal approach, isn't it, that really breeds success. A final question in from Oliver Leahy. This is really interesting. So if there was a sliding scale between being a fully coordinated part of a more homogenous student services department or a more isolated yet standout careers service with its own identity that may have separate processes from other student services, which end of this scale would you prefer?
This is a massive question. I mean, we see, I've been asked this question before, and I was very interested as a head of service experiencing different models. The typical models you would see is one is reporting directly to a strategic manager of some sort, and that has great advantages as long because that can lead to resource, but also it leads to a lot of accountability, which exposure, you get the benefits of resource, you get the negative of high exposure, but you can lose the connectivity between services. The other major one is within a traditional student-facing services, and it normally relies on the line manager, really. So if that line manager is interested in employability, the risk is that when you've got other agendas, particularly a more urgent agenda, whether that's visa compliance or welfare, they are always going to be more urgent, and rightly so. It kind of comes back to the kind of Dwight Eisenhower boxes of prioritizing work. A lot of work career services do is incredibly important, but it's not necessarily urgent in terms of anyone's going to come to any harm necessarily. So therefore, it can get pushed to second. But I've always argued that employability agendas have to be urgent. So I've kind of talked about different structures. I've seen another structure as well where you report to a learning and teaching team or academic quality. That is really beneficial for embedding employability in the curriculum because you've got people who can help careers professionals rewrite module specs and things like that. So the three areas is either straight to street management with student services or in academic quality. For me, I've seen different models, spoke to people in different models. The benefit, the manager above you has got to care about the agenda. That is absolutely clear. If it doesn't matter which of the three you've got, if they don't care, you're not going to get very far, and they've got to be pushing the agenda. The second thing that manager and that head of services got to see it as urgent. Graduate outcomes is urgent. I use that example, which I haven't timetabled out there. But again, if you make a change right now, you won't see the benefit until 2025. So there's a lot of people saying, oh, we didn't get around to it this year, and they push it on, they push it on, push it on. And we're going to be in the 2030s before we all know it. And we'll all be a decade older.
Oh no, don't leave us with that thought. Thanks, Tom. That was super interesting. I think that slide that you put up with the gigantic chaotic student experience is going to stay with me for a long time, because I guess as well that slide looks slightly different for every single student that we all have in our own institutions.
Great. No, thank you. Really good to have the conversation.